Elliot Harrington stepped out of his black Mercedes on a cold December evening in New York City. The successful businessman had just closed another $1 million deal, and his mind was already on the next meeting. At 45 years old, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse apartment, expensive cars, and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But he was alone, and the emptiness in his heart grew deeper with each passing year. He thought about his brother Michael as he did every night. 12 years had passed since Michael disappeared without a trace. The police had given up, but Elliot never stopped looking. He touched the empty spot on his wrist, where an identical gold bracelet to Michael's used to be, a matching set their parents had given them before they died. Elliot had lost his in a mugging 5 years ago, another painful reminder of all he'd lost. The street was unusually quiet for Manhattan. Snow was starting to fall, and most people had already hurried home. Elliot was checking his phone messages when he heard the screeching of tires. He looked up to see headlights coming straight at him, the car swerving wildly on the icy road. His body froze, knowing there wasn't time to move. Suddenly, something slammed into him from the side. Small, but strong hands pushed him out of the way. Elliot fell hard onto the sidewalk as the car whooshed past, missing him by inches. The drunk driver didn't even slow down, disappearing around the corner with squealing tires. "Hey, mister, you okay?" a young voice asked. Elliot sat up, his expensive suit covered in snow and dirt. A boy was standing over him, skinny, dirty, wearing clothes that were too big and too thin for winter. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old. "I'm fine," Elliot said, getting to his feet. "You saved my life. What's your name?" The boy backed away, pulling his ragged sleeve over his hand. "Tommy, don't worry about it, mister. Just be more careful next time." But Elliot wasn't listening anymore. When the boy had moved his arm, something had caught the light from the street. Lamp, something gold partially hidden under the sleeve. Elliot's heart started pounding. "Wait," he called out as Tommy turned to leave. "Your wrist, what's that bracelet you're wearing?" The boy's whole body tensed. His other hand, automatically, went to cover the bracelet. "It's nothing, just something my dad gave me before he died." Elliot stepped closer, his legs shaking. "May I see it, please?" Tommy hesitated, then slowly pulled up his sleeve. There it was, a thick gold bracelet with an intricate pattern of intertwined leaves. Elliot would have recognized it anywhere. It was identical to the one he and Michael had worn. "Where did you get this?" Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. "Who was your father?" "His name was Michael," Tommy said quietly. "Michael Harrison. He died 2 years ago." Harrison, not Harrington. But Elliot knew with absolute certainty that this was his brother's son. Michael must have changed his name when he disappeared. "Tommy," Elliot said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think I knew your father. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm your uncle." The boy's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. "You're lying. My dad never said anything about having a brother. The bracelet you're wearing, I used to have one exactly like it. They were a matching set given to me and your father by our parents." Elliot pulled out his phone and quickly found an old photo. "Look." Tommy stared at the picture of 2 smiling young men, both wearing identical gold bracelets. His hand went to his own wrist. But why didn't he ever tell me?" Tommy's voice cracked. "Why didn't he come back?" "I don't know," Elliot said honestly. "But I've been looking for him for 12 years, and now I've found you instead." He looked at the boy more carefully now, the hollow cheeks, the way he shivered in his thin jacket. "Tommy, where are you living?" The boy shrugged, looking away. "Around different places. You're homeless?" Elliot felt sick, his own nephew living on the streets. "I get by okay," Tommy said defensively. "The shelters aren't so bad when it's really cold." A gust of wind whipped down the street, and Tommy couldn't suppress a violent shiver. Elliot made a decision. "Come home with me," he said. "Just for tonight. We can talk, get warm, and figure things out. No pressure, but I'd really like to hear about your father." Tommy looked at him for a long moment, then at the photo still showing on Elliot's phone. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, "but just for tonight." As they walked to Elliot's car, snow continuing to fall around them, neither could have imagined how that one night would change both their lives forever. The bracelet that had brought them together would soon reveal secrets that had been buried for 12 long years. Secrets that some people would do anything to keep hidden. The elevator ride up to Elliot's penthouse was silent. Tommy kept glancing nervously at the mirrored walls, seeing his dirty reflection next to Elliot's expensive suit. The boy's stomach growled loudly, and he wrapped his arms around himself, embarrassed. "When's the last time you ate?" Elliot asked gently. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before." Tommy tried to sound casual, but his voice shook a little. The elevator doors opened directly into Elliot's apartment. Tommy's eyes went wide as he took in the huge living room with its wall of windows overlooking the city. Everything was sleek and modern, but somehow cold. No family photos, no personal touches. Just expensive furniture that looked like it had never been used. "First things first," Elliot said. "Let's get you something to eat. Then maybe a shower and some clean clothes." Tommy nodded, still looking around in amazement. This place is bigger than the whole shelter. While Elliot ordered food from his favorite restaurant downstairs, Tommy stood at the windows, watching the snow fall over the city. His hand kept going to the gold bracelet, touching it like a nervous habit. "Your father," Elliot said quietly, coming to stand beside him. What happened to him? Tommy's reflection in the window looked suddenly much younger than 12. He got sick, really sick. We didn't have money for doctors or medicine. He tried to keep working, but the boy's voice cracked. One morning he wouldn't wake up. Elliot felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. His brother had died alone and poor while he lived here in luxury. If only Michael had come home, had asked for help. "What about your mother?" he asked. "Never knew her. Dad said she left when I was a baby." Tommy shrugged, trying to act like it didn't matter. "It was just me and him. The food arrived, enough to feed 10 people. Tommy tried to eat slowly, but he was so hungry, he ended up wolfing down 3 plates of pasta. Elliot didn't say anything, just kept filling his glass with milk. After dinner, Elliot showed Tommy to the guest bathroom. "Take as long as you want. I'll leave some clean clothes outside the door. They might be big, but they'll be warm." While Tommy showered, Elliot sat in his home office, staring at the old photo on his phone. He and Michael, young and happy, their matching bracelets catching the sun. What had happened to drive his brother away? Why had he changed his name? And most importantly, why hadn't he asked for help when he got sick? The sound of the bathroom door opening brought him back to the present. Tommy came out wearing one of Elliot's old sweatshirts and a pair of drawstring pants rolled up multiple times. His hair was clean and combed, and without the dirt, Elliot could see how much he looked like Michael at that age. "Feel better?" Elliot asked. Tommy nodded, then yawned hugely. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Haven't slept in a real bed for a while. Come on, I'll show you your room." But as they walked down the hallway, the doorbell rang. Elliot wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. He opened the door to find Victor Chen, his company's head of security, looking grave. "Mr. Harrington, sorry to disturb you so late, but there's something you need to see." Victor glanced at Tommy, then back to Elliot. "Privately." "Wait in my office," Elliot told him. He turned to Tommy. "Your room's the second door on the right. Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." Tommy disappeared down the hallway and Elliot joined Victor in his office, closing the door. "What's so urgent?" Victor placed a file on his desk. "You asked me to keep monitoring any activity around your brother's disappearance. Today something came up." He opened the file to reveal several photographs. These were taken 2 years ago, right before Michael Harrington, or Michael Harrison as he was calling himself, died. Elliot picked up the photos with shaking hands. They showed Michael, terribly thin and sick-looking, talking to a man in an expensive suit. The man's face was familiar. "Is that Robert Maxwell?" Elliot asked in disbelief. Victor nodded grimly. "Your company's biggest competitor. And there's more. The day after this meeting, your brother's bank account received a deposit of $50,000. The next day he was found dead in his apartment." Elliot felt cold all over. Robert Maxwell had been trying to take over Harrington Industries for years. "Are you saying Maxwell had something to do with my brother's death?" "I'm saying there are a lot of questions that need answers. And now that boy shows up wearing your brother's bracelet." Victor's face was serious. Be careful, Mr. Harrington. This might be bigger than just a family reunion. After Victor left, Elliot sat in his dark office for a long time. Why had his brother met with Maxwell? What had the money been for? And most worryingly, if Maxwell was involved in Michael's death, was Tommy in danger too? Down the hall, Tommy lay awake in the huge guest bed, his father's bracelet gleaming in the darkness. He touched the small latch on the side, the one his father had made him promise never to open. Inside was something his father had called insurance, something that would keep Tommy safe if anything ever happened. "I miss you, Dad," he whispered into the darkness. "I wish you'd told me about Uncle Elliot. I wish you'd told me why you were so scared at the end." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in white. But beneath that peaceful blanket, dangerous secrets were starting to surface, secrets that had cost Michael Harrison his life and might now threaten his son. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the guest room, waking Tommy from the deepest sleep he'd had in months. For a moment he panicked, not remembering where he was. Then it all came back. The accident, Uncle Elliot, the warm shower, and real food. He heard voices coming from somewhere in the apartment. Quietly, he crept to the bedroom door and listened. "What? Do you mean you're cancelling the board meeting?" A woman's sharp voice carried down the hallway. "Elliot, the Maxwell merger vote is in 3 days. We need to finalize our strategy." "Something more important has come up, Sarah." That was Uncle Elliot's voice. "Family business." "Family." The woman laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "What family? Your brother disappeared years ago. You're all alone, Elliot. That's why this merger is so important. The company is all you have." Tommy's heart beat faster. They were talking about his dad. "Things have changed," Elliot said firmly. "And I'm starting to think this merger isn't such a good idea. Maxwell's not telling us everything." "Don't be ridiculous. Robert Maxwell is offering us a very generous deal. Our shareholders will never forgive you if you back out now." Tommy heard footsteps coming toward his room. He quickly jumped back into bed and pretended to be asleep. The door opened softly. "Tommy?" Elliot's voice was gentle. "Are you awake? There's breakfast if you're hungry." Tommy opened his eyes, trying to look sleepy. Who was that lady? The angry one? Elliot sighed. "You heard that, huh? That's Sarah Maxwell, my vice president, and Robert Maxwell's daughter." "Maxwell?" Tommy sat up straight. "Dad used to talk about him sometimes. Late at night when he thought I was sleeping, he said Maxwell was dangerous." Elliot's face went very still. "What else did your father say about him?" Tommy started to answer, but then remembered his father's words. "Don't trust anyone, Tommy. Not until you're sure it's safe." He touched the bracelet nervously. "I don't remember much," he lied. "Just that name." Elliot looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but instead he just nodded. "Come on. Let's get some breakfast. Then we need to go shopping. You can't keep wearing my old clothes." After breakfast, Elliot's driver took them to expensive stores Tommy had never dared even look at before. Elliot bought him everything: warm winter clothes, shoes, even a new backpack for school. Tommy felt uncomfortable with all the money being spent on him, but Elliot insisted. "You're my nephew," he said simply. "This is what family does." They were leaving the last store when Tommy spotted 2 men in dark suits watching them from across the street. They weren't trying very hard to hide. "Uncle Elliot," he whispered. "Those men are following us." Elliot looked where Tommy was pointing, and his face hardened. "Into the car, quickly." As their driver pulled away, Tommy saw the men getting into a black SUV. "Who are they?" "Probably Maxwell's security team." Elliot pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Victor, we need to talk. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." He hung up and turned to Tommy. "Change of plans. We're going somewhere safe." The car took them to a small coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood. Victor Chen was waiting at a corner table. His eyes went straight to Tommy's bracelet. "So it's true," Victor said quietly. "He's Michael's son," Elliot nodded. "And Maxwell's people are following us. What have you found out?" Victor pulled out his laptop. "I've been digging into the $50,000 Michael received. It was transferred through 5 different shell companies before reaching him. But here's the interesting part. 2 days after Michael died, a similar amount was transferred from one of Maxwell's private accounts to a law firm specializing in corporate espionage. "Dad said the bracelet would keep me safe," Tommy blurted out. Both men turned to look at him. He said there was something inside it. Insurance." Elliot leaned forward. "Inside the bracelet? Can you open it?" Tommy's hand went protectively to his wrist. "He made me promise not to. Not unless." "Unless what, Tommy?" "Unless they found me first." Tommy's voice shook. "He said if they ever found me, I should open it and take what's inside straight to the newspapers." Victor's face went pale. "Mr. Harrington, if what I suspect is true, that bracelet might contain proof of Maxwell's illegal activities. Information your brother discovered before he died. Information worth killing for," Elliot said grimly. Just then, the coffee shop door opened. Sarah Maxwell walked in, her high heels clicking on the floor. She stopped at their table, her red lips curved in a cold smile. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she said. "A family reunion, how sweet." She looked directly at Tommy. "You must be Michael's boy. You know, your father and I had a very interesting conversation just before he died, about that lovely bracelet you're wearing." Tommy felt sick. The way she said it, she had known his father, known about his death. "Sarah," Elliot stood up, putting himself between her and Tommy. "What are you doing here?" "Delivering a message from my father." Her smile never wavered. "The merger vote is in 3 days, Elliot. Don't let ancient history cloud your judgment. Some secrets are better left buried." She turned to leave, then looked back at Tommy. "Oh, and dear? If I were you, I'd be very careful with family heirlooms. They have a way of getting lost." After she left, Tommy was shaking so hard he could barely speak. She knew about Dad, about everything. Elliot put his arm around Tommy's shoulders. "It's okay. You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." But as they left the coffee shop, Tommy saw the men in dark suits were back, watching from their black SUV. And he knew that his father had been right all along. The truth inside the bracelet wasn't just insurance. It was the only thing keeping him alive. Elliot paced his living room late that night, unable to sleep. Victor had insisted they stay at a secure hotel, but Elliot refused. His penthouse had the best security system money could buy. Still, he'd posted extra guards in the lobby and hallway. In the guest room, Tommy tossed and turned, his father's last days playing over and over in his mind. The way Dad had gotten so nervous near the end, how he'd made Tommy memorize the names of certain newspapers and reporters, the way he'd gripped Tommy's shoulders that final night, eyes desperate. "If anything happens to me," he'd said, "find someone you can trust, but be careful. The people who want this bracelet, they're powerful. They'll pretend to be your friends." Tommy sat up in bed, his decision made. He had to know what was inside the bracelet. Had to know what had really happened to his father. The bedroom door creaked open. "Can't sleep either?" Elliot asked softly. Tommy shook his head. "I keep thinking about what?" Sarah Maxwell said. "About talking to Dad before he died." Elliot came and sat on the edge of the bed. "Tommy, I need you to be completely honest with me. What else did your father tell you? About Maxwell? About the company? Anything that might help us understand what's going on?" Tommy took a deep breath. He said he found something bad, really bad. Something illegal that Mr. Maxwell was doing. That's why we had to hide, change our names." He touched the bracelet. "Dad said the proof was in here, but he was scared to use it. Said Maxwell would hurt people if he did." "What kind of proof?" Elliot asked gently. "I don't know. But the night before he died, Dad was really sick. He could barely talk. But he made me promise, if they ever found me, I should open the bracelet and take what's inside to someone named Linda Chen at the New York Times." Elliot's eyes widened. Linda Chen, Victor's wife. Before Tommy could answer, the lights in the apartment went out. Complete darkness fell. "Uncle Elliot?" Tommy's voice shook. "It's okay," Elliot said quickly. "The backup generator will kick in," but it didn't. And then they heard it. The soft sound of the balcony door being opened. Elliot grabbed Tommy's arm. "Quick, into the closet." He shoved Tommy into his walk-in closet, pushing him behind hanging suits. No matter what you hear, stay quiet. Don't come out until I come get you." Through a crack in the closet door, Tommy watched shadows moving in the darkness. Flashlight beams swept across the room. He could hear quiet footsteps, whispered voices. "Find the boy," a man's voice ordered. "The bracelet is all that matters." Tommy's heart was beating so hard he was sure they would hear it. He pressed further back into the closet, behind the suits. His hand brushed against something, a small door. In the back wall, more voices from the bedroom. "Where are they?" "Keep looking. Maxwell wants that bracelet tonight." Tommy's fingers found a handle on the small door. A laundry chute, maybe. He pulled it open as quietly as he could. It was small, but so was he. Years of living on the street had taught him how to squeeze into tight spaces. He heard a crash from the bedroom, then Elliot's voice, angry. "Get out of my house." The sound of a struggle, something breaking, a cry of pain. Tommy slipped into the chute feet first. It was narrow and dark, but he could feel it sloping down. He took a deep breath and let himself slide. The metal chute seemed to go on forever. Tommy tried not to think about where it might end. Finally, he shot out into some kind of room, the building's laundry room, he realized. It was dark and empty at this late hour. He could hear shouts and running footsteps from above. The emergency stairs door burst open, and men with flashlights started down. Tommy ducked behind a row of industrial dryers, trying to make himself as small as possible. "He has to be down here somewhere," one of the men said. "Check everything." Tommy's whole body was shaking. What had they done to Uncle Elliot? Was he hurt or worse? The men were getting closer to his hiding spot. In desperation, Tommy looked at the bracelet. His father's voice echoed in his head. "If they find you, open it." His trembling fingers found the tiny latch. It clicked open. Inside was a small memory card, no bigger than his fingernail. This was it. The proof his father had died protecting. The truth about Robert Maxwell's footsteps came closer. A flashlight beam swept past his hiding spot. Tommy did the only thing he could think of. He put the memory card in his mouth, tucking it under his tongue. Then he snapped the bracelet closed, just as rough hands grabbed him. "Got him!" A man yanked Tommy to his feet. "Call Mr. Maxwell, tell him we have the boy and the bracelet." "Let me go." Tommy struggled, but the man was too strong. Now," a familiar voice said from the doorway. "Is that any way to treat our young guest?" Sarah Maxwell stepped into the laundry room, her high heels clicking on the concrete floor. She smiled at Tommy, but her eyes were cold as ice. "Your uncle is taking a little nap upstairs," she said. "He'll be fine, just a bump on the head. And you're going to come with us for a while. Your father and I have some unfinished business to discuss." Tommy felt the memory card under his tongue, the truth about his father's death, the proof of whatever Maxwell had done. Sarah held out her hand. "The bracelet, please." Tommy looked at her expensive clothes, her perfect makeup, her cruel smile. He thought about his father, sick and alone, trying to protect him until the very end, and he made his choice. "Okay," he said. He held out his arm. "You can have it." Sarah's smile widened as she reached for the bracelet. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that its secret was already safe. Tommy silently made another promise to his father. The truth would come out. No matter what happened next, he would make sure of that, even if it meant taking on the most powerful family in New York. The black SUV sped through the empty streets of nighttime Manhattan. Tommy sat in the back, squeezed between two of Maxwell's men. The memory card felt huge under his tongue, though he knew it was tiny. His heart wouldn't stop racing. Sarah Maxwell sat in the front seat, the gold bracelet now in her possession. She kept turning it over in her hands, examining every inch of it. "Where is it?" she muttered. "There has to be something here." Tommy tried not to smile. Let her look all she wanted. The real secret was safely hidden away. His thoughts went to Uncle Elliot lying unconscious in the penthouse. At least they hadn't killed him. Tommy had to believe he would wake up soon and come looking. The car pulled up to a massive glass building, Maxwell Industries headquarters. Even at this late hour, lights blazed from several floors. "Bring him upstairs," Sarah ordered. "My father will want to speak with him personally." The elevator ride felt endless. Tommy counted the floors as they went up, 20, 30, 40. Finally, they reached the top floor. The doors opened onto a huge office with windows overlooking the entire city. Robert Maxwell stood at those windows, his back to them. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and an expensive suit. When he turned around, Tommy was struck by how much he looked like an older version of the man from the photos with his father. "So," Maxwell said softly, "Michael's son, you look just like him at that age." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I knew your father quite well, you know, at the end." "You killed him," Tommy said. The words came out before he could stop them. Maxwell's smile didn't waver. "Such an imagination. Your father was very sick, Tommy. We tried to help him, offered him the best medical care, but he refused." "Liar." Tommy tried to lunge forward, but the men held him back. "Sarah," Maxwell said calmly, "the bracelet." She handed it to him. Maxwell examined it carefully, then went to his desk and pulled out a jeweler's loop. "Interesting design," he murmured. "Your grandfather had excellent taste. But where did Michael hide it?" He looked up at Tommy. "What did your father tell you about this bracelet?" Tommy said nothing. One of the men grabbed his arm roughly. "Answer, Mr. Maxwell." Now, Maxwell said. "No need for that. Tommy and I are just having a friendly chat." He set down the bracelet and walked over to Tommy. "You're in quite a difficult position, young man. No family except an uncle you just met. No home, no money. It must have been very hard living on the streets." Tommy stayed silent, but his heart was pounding. "I can change all that," Maxwell continued. "Tell me what your father hid in this bracelet, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. Private school, trust fund, anything you want. You'll never have to worry about money again." For a moment, Tommy thought about how nice that would be. No more being hungry, no more sleeping in shelters. But then he remembered his father's face that last night, how desperate he'd been to protect whatever was on that memory card. "I don't know anything," Tommy said. "Dad never told me about the bracelet. He just said to keep it safe." Maxwell studied his face for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Sarah, call our friends at the police department. Report a runaway who stole a valuable family heirloom. I'm sure they'll be very interested in finding young Tommy." "Wait!" a new voice rang out. Everyone turned to see Victor Chen standing in the doorway, his gun drawn. "Step away from the boy." "Ah, Mr. Chen." Maxwell didn't seem surprised at all. "I was wondering when you'd join us. Sarah, would you get the door?" Sarah Maxwell moved toward the door, but instead of closing it, she pulled it wide open. More men in suits entered, but these weren't Maxwell's people. They wore FBI jackets. "Robert Maxwell," one of them said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, corporate fraud, and suspected murder." Maxwell's face went white. "This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to my lawyers." "Dad?" Sarah's voice shook. "What's going on?" "Your father has been under investigation for months," Victor said. "We just needed the final piece of evidence." He looked at Tommy. "Which I believe you have." Tommy nodded. Carefully, he took the memory card from under his tongue. One of the FBI agents quickly put it into a plastic evidence bag. "You little brat," Sarah snarled. She grabbed for Tommy, but Victor was faster, pulling him safely away. "Get them out of here," the FBI agent ordered. As they led Maxwell and Sarah away in handcuffs, Tommy could hear Maxwell shouting about his lawyers. "Are you okay?" Victor asked Tommy. "Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine. But Uncle Elliot? They hit him. He's still at the penthouse." "He's okay," Victor assured him. "He woke up right after they took you. He's the one who called me. He's on his way here now." Tommy felt his legs go weak with relief. It was over, really over. But there was still one thing he needed to know. "Victor," he asked quietly, "what was on that memory card? What did my dad find out?" Victor's face grew serious. "Your father worked in Maxwell's accounting department. He discovered that Maxwell was embezzling millions from his own company, using the money to bribe government officials. When your father threatened to expose him, Maxwell had him followed, threatened him. That's why your father changed his name. But then why did Maxwell give him money right before he died?" "Blackmail," Victor said grimly. "Your father was dying, needed money for medicine. Maxwell thought he could buy his silence, but your father was smarter than that. He copied all the evidence onto that memory card and hid it in the one place he knew you'd keep safe, the bracelet." Tommy heard running footsteps in the hallway. Then Elliot burst in, a bandage on his head but otherwise okay. "Tommy." Elliot wrapped him in a tight hug. "Thank God you're safe. I was so worried." Tommy hugged him back, finally letting himself cry. It was all too much, the fear, the relief, the truth about his father. "Your brother was a hero," Victor told Elliot quietly. "He gave his life to expose Maxwell's crimes, and his son is just as brave." Elliot kept his arm around Tommy's shoulders as they rode the elevator down. Police cars with flashing lights filled the street outside. They could see Maxwell and Sarah being put into separate cars. "What happens now?" Tommy asked. "Now," Elliot said. "You come home for real this time. No more running, no more hiding." He smiled down at his nephew. "Just family." Tommy looked at the gold bracelet, now back on his wrist where it belonged. It felt lighter somehow, now that it had given up its secret. But as they drove away from Maxwell Industries, Tommy knew that the bracelet's real purpose had nothing to do with memory cards or evidence. It had led him to the one thing he thought he'd lost forever when his father died: a family. The next morning, newspapers across New York blazed with headlines about Robert Maxwell's arrest. Television news crews camped outside Maxwell Industries, reporting on the scandal that had brought down one of the city's most powerful businessmen. Elliot and Tommy watched the coverage from the safety of Victor's home, where they'd spent the night. Tommy hadn't wanted to go back to the penthouse, not after what had happened there. Maxwell Industries CEO arrested in massive fraud scheme, the news anchor announced. Sources say evidence was provided by the son of a former employee who died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago. "They're not using your name," Elliot explained, seeing Tommy's worried look. "Victor made sure of that. You're still a minor. They can't identify you without permission." Tommy nodded, relieved. He was curled up in a big armchair, wearing borrowed pajamas from Victor's son. He hadn't slept much despite being exhausted. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah Maxwell's cold smile, felt rough hands grabbing him in the dark. Linda Chen, Victor's wife, brought in a tray of hot chocolate and cookies. She was a reporter for the New York Times, the very one Tommy's father had wanted him to contact. Victor had called her as soon as Maxwell was arrested. "How are you holding up?" she asked Tommy gently. "Okay, I guess." Tommy wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "I just keep thinking about Dad, about how scared he must have been knowing what Maxwell could do." Linda sat down next to him. "Your father was very brave. He could have taken Maxwell's money and stayed quiet. Instead, he made sure the truth would come out, even if he couldn't be here to see it." "The police want to talk to Tommy," Victor said, coming into the room. "About the night his father died. They're reopening the investigation." Tommy's hands started shaking so badly that hot chocolate sloshed over the rim of his mug. Elliot quickly moved to sit on the arm of his chair. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he assured Tommy. "It can wait." But Tommy straightened his shoulders. "No, I want to tell them. Dad deserves justice." The detectives who came to interview Tommy were kind, speaking to him gently and letting him take breaks when memories became too painful. He told them everything, how his father had gotten sicker and sicker, refusing to go to the hospital because he was afraid Maxwell would find them. How that last night someone had come to their tiny apartment. "I was supposed to be asleep," Tommy said quietly, "but I heard voices. Dad was arguing with someone, a woman. She said time was running out, that Mr. Maxwell's patience was gone." He swallowed hard. "The next morning, Dad wouldn't wake up." "Sarah Maxwell," Victor said grimly. The detectives nodded, making notes. After the police left, Tommy was exhausted. He fell asleep on the couch while the adults talked in low voices about lawyers and court cases and witness protection. He woke up hours later to find Elliot sitting nearby, watching him with worried eyes. "You had a nightmare," Elliot explained. "You were calling out for your dad." Tommy sat up, embarrassed. "Sorry." "Don't be sorry." Elliot moved to sit beside him. "Tommy, there's something I need to ask you, something important." Tommy tensed, wondering what was coming. "I want to adopt you," Elliot said simply. "Legally make you my son, if that's something you'd want." Tommy stared at him, stunned. But you barely know me." "I know enough." Elliot's voice was firm. "I know you're brave and smart and loyal. I know you're my brother's son, and I know that I already love you like you were my own." Tears filled Tommy's eyes. What if Maxwell's lawyers get him out of jail? What if Sarah comes after us again? Then we'll face it together. Elliot put his arm around Tommy's shoulders. "No more running, remember? This time you have people to protect you." Tommy thought about it. He thought about his father, about the bracelet that had brought him to his uncle, about how tired he was of being alone and afraid. "Okay," he whispered, "I want that too." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Lawyers came and went, papers were signed, and slowly the adoption process began. Tommy started seeing a counselor to help him deal with the trauma of his father's death and his time on the streets. Elliot hired extra security for their new home, a beautiful brownstone far from the old penthouse. Sarah Maxwell and her father were denied bail, considered flight risks because of their wealth and connections. The investigation into Michael's death was reopened, with Sarah as the prime suspect. One evening, Tommy found Elliot in his home office, looking at old family photos. "What was Dad like?" Tommy asked. "When you were young?" Elliot smiled, making room for Tommy beside him. "He was amazing. Always looking out for everyone else, always trying to do the right thing, just like you." They spent hours looking at pictures, Elliot telling stories about his brother that made Tommy laugh and cry. It felt good to know his father had been loved, had been happy once. "I miss him so much," Tommy admitted. "Me too, buddy." Elliot hugged him close. "But you know what? He's still watching over us. He made sure we'd find each other." Tommy touched the gold bracelet, no longer hiding secrets, but still precious, still connecting him to his father, and now to his new family too. Outside, the city was changing as spring arrived. The scandal at Maxwell Industries continued to make headlines, but Tommy was safely wrapped in the love of his new family. Victor and Linda had become like an uncle and aunt, their son Jake, his first real friend, and every night, when Tommy went to bed in his new room, he looked at the family photo Elliot had framed for him, his father and uncle as young men, wearing their matching bracelets, smiling at the camera without a hint of the tragedy to come. "Did it, Dad?" he would whisper. "I kept my promise, the truth came out." And sometimes in the quiet of night, he could almost hear his father's voice, proud and loving. "You did good, son, you did so good." 3 months after Maxwell's arrest, life had settled into a new normal for Tommy and Elliot. The adoption was moving forward, and Tommy had started at a private school where Jake, Victor's son, helped him adjust to his new life. But just when everything seemed perfect, the past came knocking again. It started with a letter delivered to their new home. Tommy came back from school to find Elliot in the kitchen, holding an expensive-looking envelope and looking worried. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, dropping his backpack by the door. "It's from Caroline Maxwell," Elliot said. "Robert Maxwell's wife. She wants to meet with us." Tommy felt his stomach twist. "Why? What does she want?" "She says she has information about your father, something that wasn't on the memory card." Elliot looked at Tommy carefully. "But we don't have to meet her if you don't want to." Tommy thought about it. He'd never met Mrs. Maxwell. She'd been traveling in Europe when everything happened with Sarah and Mr. Maxwell. The newspapers said she'd rushed home when the scandal broke, filed for divorce, and disappeared from public view. "What? If it's a trap?" Tommy asked. "Victor's already checking it out," Elliot assured him. "She's offered to meet us at her lawyer's office in broad daylight with witnesses present." Tommy touched his father's bracelet, a habit he still hadn't broken. "I want to know. Whatever it is, I want to know." The next day, they went to a fancy law office in downtown Manhattan. Caroline Maxwell was nothing like Tommy had imagined. She was in her 50s, elegant but tired-looking, with kind eyes that reminded him of his school librarian. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. She looked directly at Tommy. "I've wanted to meet you for a long time. Your father, he tried to warn me about what Robert was doing. I didn't listen. I should have." Tommy didn't know what to say. This wasn't the angry confrontation he'd expected. "What do you mean he tried to warn you?" Elliot asked. Caroline opened her purse and took out an old envelope. "Michael came to see me about a week before he died. He gave me this letter, made me promise to keep it safe. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his son got it. Her voice cracked. I was too afraid to do anything when Robert was free, but now... She handed the envelope to Tommy. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter written in his father's familiar handwriting. "Dear Tommy," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, then I didn't make it. I'm so sorry, son. There's so much I wanted to tell you but couldn't. About your mother, about why we had to run. The truth is..." Tommy's voice broke. Elliot put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Your mother didn't abandon us," the letter continued. "Her name was Rachel Chen. Yes, Victor and Linda's sister." Tommy's head snapped up. "What?" Caroline nodded sadly. "That's why I had to tell you. You have more family than you know." Tommy kept reading, tears falling onto the paper. "Rachel worked at Maxwell Industries too. She was the first one to notice something wrong with the company's books. She and I started investigating together. We fell in love, got married in secret because we knew it wasn't safe. When she got pregnant with you, we planned to take everything. We'd found to the authorities, but then..." Tommy couldn't read anymore. Elliot gently took the letter and continued, "Maxwell's people found out what we were doing. There was an accident, a car crash that wasn't really an accident. Rachel didn't survive. I took you and ran, changed our names, tried to hide, but I never stopped trying to prove what Maxwell had done. Rachel died trying to expose the truth. I couldn't let that be for nothing." The room was silent except for Tommy's quiet sobs. "Victor and Linda never knew," Caroline said softly. "Rachel disappeared so completely, they thought she'd just abandoned them." Robert made sure of that. He was very good at making people disappear. "Does Victor know now?" Tommy asked through his tears. "I called him this morning," Caroline said. "He and Linda are on their way." As if on cue, the office door burst open. Linda Chen rushed in, her face streaked with tears. She stopped when she saw Tommy, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You have her eyes. How did I not see it before? You have Rachel's eyes." She crossed the room and pulled Tommy into a fierce hug. He buried his face in her shoulder, breathing in the same perfume his mother had worn. The scent triggered a memory, so faint he hadn't even known he had it. Victor came in more slowly, his face showing the shock of learning his long-lost sister had been murdered, that his nephew had been right under his nose all these months. "I should have protected her," he said roughly. "I should have known something was wrong when she disappeared." "It wasn't your fault," Caroline said. "Robert was very careful. He made it look like Rachel had embezzled money, run away to Europe. Even I believed it, until Michael came to me with proof. So that's what was on the memory card," Elliot said. "Not just proof of Maxwell's crimes, but proof of what really happened to Rachel." Caroline nodded. "Robert will spend the rest of his life in prison, not just for fraud, but for murder. Sarah too, she knew everything, helped cover it up." Tommy pulled away from Linda, wiping his eyes. "All this time, I had an aunt and uncle right here, and they were helping me without even knowing who I really was. Family finds a way," Linda said softly. "Rachel always believed that." Later that night, back home, Tommy sat in his room looking at the letter. There was so much to process. Learning about his mother, discovering his connection to Victor and Linda, understanding finally why his father had been so desperate to protect him. Elliot knocked on his door. "You okay, buddy?" Tommy nodded. "Just thinking. You know what's weird? Dad was right about the bracelet keeping me safe, but not because of what was inside it. It led me to you and to Victor and Linda, to family." Elliot sat beside him on the bed. "Your father was a smart man. He knew the most important thing wasn't exposing Maxwell. It was making sure you'd be taken care of, that you'd find people to love you." "Did you know her?" Tommy asked. "My mom?" "A little. She was beautiful and kind and so brave, just like you." Elliot smiled. "And now you have a whole album of photos coming. Linda's bringing them tomorrow." Tommy touched the bracelet one last time before getting ready for bed. He had so many questions still, so much to learn about his mother and father. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had a family, an uncle who loved him like a son, an aunt and uncle who were actually his blood relatives, a cousin who was already his best friend, and somewhere he knew his parents were watching. Finally at peace, knowing their son was safe, loved and surrounded by family. The truth hadn't just set him free, it had brought him home. Summer arrived in New York, bringing with it new challenges and joys for the expanded family. Linda had moved into the brownstone temporarily, unable to bear being separated from the nephew she'd just found. She spent hours showing Tommy photos of his mother, telling stories about Rachel's childhood, helping him understand where he came from. She loved strawberry ice cream, Linda told him one evening as they sat in the garden, and she could play the piano beautifully. She taught me everything I know about music. Tommy soaked up every detail like a sponge. Each new piece of information about his mother felt like a precious gift. But with knowledge came pain too. One morning, Tommy came downstairs to find Linda crying over an old photo album. Victor sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," Linda said when she saw Tommy. "It's just, today would have been Rachel's birthday. We used to always celebrate together, all three of us." Tommy sat down with them, looking at photos of his mother's past birthdays. Rachel Chen's smile was exactly like his, something he'd never known until now. "Tell me about her birthday traditions," he said softly. Linda wiped her eyes. She always wanted the same cake, chocolate with raspberry filling, and she'd make everyone wear party hats, even though we were grown-ups. "We should do that," Tommy said suddenly. "We should celebrate her birthday, make her cake, wear the hats, tell stories about her. She shouldn't be forgotten." Linda hugged him tight. "That's a wonderful idea." The birthday celebration turned into a family gathering. Elliot helped Tommy and Linda bake the chocolate raspberry cake. Victor brought old home movies he'd found in his attic. Even Caroline Maxwell came, bringing more letters Michael had written to Rachel that she'd found in Robert's study. As they sat in the garden, wearing bright party hats and sharing memories, Tommy felt his mother's presence all around him. He wore her bracelet now too, a delicate gold chain Linda had given him that had belonged to Rachel. But life wasn't all celebration. The trial of Robert and Sarah Maxwell was approaching, and Tommy would have to testify. The nightmares started, coming back. Dreams of dark rooms and rough hands grabbing him, of his father's last days and his mother's tragic end. One night, the dreams were so bad that Tommy woke up screaming. Elliot rushed in, followed quickly by Linda from her room down the hall. "It's okay," Elliot soothed, holding Tommy as he shook. "You're safe." "I saw them," Tommy gasped. "Mom and Dad. In the dream they were trying to warn me about something we still don't know." Linda and Elliot exchanged worried looks. "It was just a nightmare," Linda said gently. "The trial's getting closer. It's natural to be scared." But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The next day, he asked to see the evidence from his father's apartment, things the police had collected after his death. Most of it was in storage, but Victor had copies of everything. "Are you sure about this?" Victor asked as he brought out the boxes. "It might be painful," Tommy nodded. "I need to know everything for Mom and Dad." They spent hours going through old papers, receipts, notebooks. Tommy recognized his father's handwriting, the way he'd make little drawings in the margins when he was thinking. And then he found something strange, a receipt for a storage unit paid up for 20 years in advance. "Uncle Victor," Tommy called. "Look at this. Did anyone ever check this storage unit?" Victor examined the receipt. "I don't think so. This address, it's in New Jersey, outside the jurisdiction of the NYPD." Tommy felt his heart speed up. "We need to go there now," Victor called Elliot, who left work immediately to join them. The drive to New Jersey felt endless. Tommy kept thinking about his dream, about his parents trying to tell him something. The storage facility was old and run down. The manager took forever checking their ID and paperwork. Finally, they stood in front of a rolling metal door marked Unit 23. Victor lifted the door and they switched on flashlights. The unit was mostly empty except for a single filing cabinet and an old trunk. "The cabinet's locked," Elliot said, trying the drawers. "Wait." Tommy remembered something. The bracelet. Dad's bracelet had a tiny key hidden in the clasp. I never knew what it was for. With trembling fingers, Tommy opened the hidden compartment in the bracelet's clasp. A small key fell into his palm. It fit perfectly. Inside the cabinet were more files, hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, and USB drives. But it was what they found in the trunk that made them all gasp. Diaries, dozens of them. Rachel's diaries dating back years before Tommy was born, and Michael's journals too, telling their whole story. She knew, Tommy whispered, reading the last entry in his mother's diary. She knew Maxwell was going to try to kill her. She wrote everything down, left all the evidence here, and Dad found it after she died. That's why he ran with you, Victor said, his voice rough with emotion. He knew if Maxwell found out about this place, you'd both be in danger. But he made sure we'd find it eventually, Tommy said. The receipt, the key and the bracelet, he left us a trail of breadcrumbs. They spent hours reading through the diaries and files. They revealed an even bigger conspiracy than anyone had imagined. More powerful people involved, more crimes covered up. Maxwell hadn't acted alone. There were others still out there, still free. We need to get all of this to the FBI, Victor said, and we need to be very careful. If the wrong people find out what we've discovered, I'm not afraid anymore, Tommy said firmly. Mom and Dad died trying to expose the truth. We owe it to them to finish what they started. Elliot put his arm around Tommy's shoulders. We'll do it together, all of us. As they drove home that night, Tommy held his mother's diaries in his lap. He felt different somehow, stronger, more certain of who he was and what he had to do. The trial wasn't the end of the story after all. It was just the beginning. His parents had left him more than just bracelets and memories. They'd left him a mission to expose the whole truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. And this time he had a whole family to help him do it. The contents of the storage unit changed everything. Tommy spent every free moment reading his parents' diaries, getting to know them through their own words. His mother's voice was warm and funny in her writing, full of hope, even when she described discovering Maxwell's crimes. His father's journals showed his transformation from a naive young accountant to a man determined to protect his family at any cost. But it was the list of names that really shook them. Politicians, judges, business leaders, all involved in Maxwell's scheme. The FBI was building cases against them quietly, not wanting to tip anyone off. You'll have to testify against more people now, Linda said worriedly one evening. Are you sure you're ready for that? Tommy looked up from his mother's diary. Mom wrote that the scariest choice is usually the right one. She knew they might kill her, but she kept gathering evidence anyway. I have to be as brave as she was. The next day, Tommy had just gotten home from school when Victor burst into the house, his face pale. Someone broke into my office, he said. They were looking for something specific. All my files about Rachel's case are gone. Elliot immediately called their security team. Linda rushed to check that all the diaries and evidence were still safely locked away in the brownstone's vault. They know, Tommy said quietly. They know we found Mom's evidence. As if to confirm his words, Tommy's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your parents should have learned to let sleeping dogs lie. Don't make their mistake. The adults argued about what to do. Victor wanted to put Tommy in witness protection. Linda thought they should go public with everything immediately. Elliot insisted they had to trust the FBI to handle it. But Tommy had his own idea. Mom and Dad died trying to do this alone, he said, but we don't have to. We have something they didn't, the public's attention. He looked at Linda. You're a reporter. If we tell the whole story, not just about Maxwell, but about Mom and Dad, about everything they discovered, people will listen. The truth will be too big to hide. It's dangerous, Elliot warned. Everything's dangerous, Tommy said, but Mom wrote something in her diary that I can't stop thinking about. She said, the truth isn't just about facts and evidence. It's about stories, human stories that make people care. Linda nodded slowly. A story about two young people who fell in love while trying to expose corruption. About a mother who died, trying to make the world better for her son. About a father who protected his child until his last breath. About a boy who found his way home through a golden bracelet. And found a family who helped him finish what his parents started, Tommy added. They worked through the night, Tommy, Linda, and Caroline Maxwell, who brought even more documents she'd found. They wove together the story of Rachel and Michael, of corruption and courage, of love and loss and justice. The article was scheduled to run the next morning in the New York Times. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He sat in the garden wearing both bracelets, his father's gold one and his mother's delicate chain. Elliot found him there just before dawn. Having second thoughts? He asked. Tommy shook his head. Just talking to Mom and Dad, telling them what we're about to. Elliot sat beside him. You know, when I first met you, I thought I was the one who would protect you. But really, you've taught me about courage. Your parents would be so proud. I'm scared, Tommy admitted. Not of the bad guys exactly. More like, what if we do all this and nothing changes? What if people don't care? People will care, Elliot said firmly. Because you make them care. You made me care that first night when you saved my life. You made Victor and Linda care, even before they knew you were family. You made Caroline care enough to turn against her own husband. Tommy's phone buzzed again, another threat from an unknown number. But this time he didn't feel afraid. Mom wrote that she wasn't fighting against something, she was fighting for something, he said. For me, for Dad, for what was right. That's what we're doing too. The sky was starting to lighten. Soon the story would break. Soon everyone would know about Rachel Chen and Michael Harrison, about their love and sacrifice, about the son who carried their legacy in 2 golden bracelets. Whatever happens, Elliot said, we face it together, as a family. Tommy touched both bracelets, feeling closer to his parents than ever. The morning sun began to rise over New York City, painting the sky in shades of hope. The truth wouldn't stay buried any longer, and neither would his parents dream of justice. Linda came out to join them, her phone in hand. It's time, she said softly. Are you ready? Tommy stood up, feeling the strength of his whole family behind him. Mom and Dad were ready to die for the truth, he said. I'm ready to live for it. Inside, the evidence waited to be shared with the world. The story of 2 brave people who fell in love while fighting corruption. The story of their son, who found his way home through a golden bracelet. The story of a family united by love, truth, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The sun rose higher, bringing with it the dawn of a new day. And somewhere Tommy knew his parents were watching, proud of the son who had found not just justice, but the one thing they'd wanted most for him, a family to love him, support him, and help him carry on their legacy of courage. The story broke like a tidal wave across New York City. Linda's article, titled "The Golden Bracelet, A Story of Love, Loss, and Justice," ran on the front page of the New York Times. By noon, every major news network was covering it. People couldn't stop talking about Rachel Chen and Michael Harrison, the young lovers who gave their lives trying to expose corruption. Tommy watched it all from the safety of the brownstone, surrounded by his family. The phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning. More reporters wanting interviews, more witnesses coming forward with evidence, more victims of Maxwell's crimes finally ready to speak out. Look at this, Linda said, showing them her laptop. The story's trending nationwide. People are calling for investigations into everyone named in Rachel's evidence. Victor came in from another phone call with the FBI. 3 arrests already, he announced. A judge, a state senator, and the police commissioner, they're all scrambling to make deals, turning on each other. Tommy felt overwhelmed. His parents' fight for justice had become so much bigger than he'd imagined. But then his phone buzzed with yet another message from an unknown number. You'll regret this. Watch your back. Elliot saw Tommy looking at his phone and took it gently from his hands. No more threats, he said firmly. They can't hurt us anymore. The truth is out there now. Too many people know it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. More arrests were made. More evidence came to light. The trial dates were set, not just for the Maxwells now, but for everyone involved in the conspiracy. Tommy had to testify multiple times, telling his story again and again. But this time he wasn't afraid. Every time he took the witness stand, he wore both bracelets, his father's gold one and his mother's delicate chain. They gave him strength. Sarah Maxwell was the first to be sentenced, 20 years in prison, for her role in Michael's death and the cover-up of Rachel's murder. When the verdict was read, she looked straight at Tommy with hatred in her eyes. But Tommy just touched his bracelets and held his head high. Robert Maxwell's trial was longer, more complicated, but in the end, justice prevailed. He was found guilty on all counts, including the murders of Rachel Chen and Michael Harrison. The judge gave him life in prison without possibility of parole. Your greed and corruption didn't just steal money, the judge told Maxwell. It stole a mother from her son, a father from his child, a sister from her siblings. No sentence can repair that damage, but at least now the truth is known. After the trial, life began to settle into a new normal. The adoption was finalized. Tommy was officially Elliot's son. They kept the brownstone, with Linda living in the garden apartment downstairs. Victor and his family moved into the house next door. Tommy started his first year of high school that fall. His story was known. Now other kids sometimes whispered and pointed, but he didn't mind. He was proud of his parents, proud of their courage and sacrifice. One evening, about a year after the story first broke, the whole family gathered in the garden to celebrate Rachel's birthday again. They had chocolate raspberry cake, wore silly, party hats, and told stories about both Rachel and Michael. "I found something else in Mum's diaries," Tommy told them as they sat around the garden table. "Something I hadn't noticed before." He opened the diary to a marked page and read, "My dearest Tommy, if you're reading this, then our plan didn't work out the way we hoped. But remember, the most valuable things in life aren't money or power or even justice. They're the connections we make, the love we share, the family we build. Your father and I may not be there to watch you grow up, but I know in my heart you'll find your way to people who will love you as much as we do." Tommy looked around at his family. Elliot, who had become the father he needed. Linda, who shared his mother's laugh. Victor, who taught him about strength and loyalty. Jake, who was more than a cousin but his best friend. And Caroline, who had chosen truth over loyalty to her husband. "Mom was right," he said softly. "Even with everything that happened, all the pain and loss, I found my way home. To all of you." Elliot raised his glass. "To Rachel and Michael," he said, "who gave us the greatest gift, each other." Everyone echoed the toast, their glasses catching the light of the setting sun. Tommy touched both bracelets, feeling the connection to his past and his present, to the parents who had loved him enough to die for the truth and the family who had helped him honor their sacrifice. The next morning, Tommy had an interview with a national news show. They wanted to do a story about what had changed in the year since the scandal broke. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets about going public with his parents' evidence. "None," Tommy said firmly. "Mom wrote in her diary that the truth isn't just about exposing what's wrong. It's about showing what's right, about love and courage and family. That's the real story here. Not the corruption or the crimes, but the way love wins in the end. The way family finds each other." After the interview, Tommy walked home through the city streets. So much had changed in the past year. Maxwell Industries had been reformed under new leadership. Laws had been passed to prevent similar corruption. People had learned to pay attention, to speak up, to fight for what was right. But the biggest change was in Tommy himself. He was no longer the scared, lonely boy from the streets. He had a home, a family, a purpose. He carried his parents' legacy, not as a burden now, but as a gift. The golden bracelet that had started it all still shone on his wrist, next to his mother's delicate chain. They were more than jewelry now. They were reminders that love never dies, that truth finds its way to the light, that family is about more than blood. That evening, Tommy sat in the garden writing in his own diary, something he'd started doing after reading his parents' journals. He wrote about love and loss, about justice and healing, about the family that had been born from tragedy. And somewhere he knew Rachel and Michael were watching. Proud of their son, at peace with their sacrifice, knowing that their love story hadn't ended with their deaths. It lived on in Tommy, in the truth he'd helped reveal, and in the family that had grown from a single golden bracelet. The end.